Hello, hello, and welcome to Retrospective Rants with me, Joey Huff, as your host. This here is going to be another bullet point episode, but this time I'm going to be ranting on why I'm scared of horror movies. Well, not really. I'm just going to talk about why I'm not the biggest fan. Anyway, let's get to the action. First off, I'd like to preface with I'm not trying to say that horror movies as a genre are bad or that there are no good horror movies because the movies made by Alfred Hitchcock or Alien by Ridley Scott or the whole onslaught of Kubrick cinema they are all massive contributions to the medium of film and to the general art of storytelling. Nothing I say will ever change that because Ridley Scott is already destroying his own legacy. It'd be funnier if it wasn't true. Anyway, in my mind, good horror, or classic horror, well-constructed horror movies, whatever you want to call it, focuses on the unknown, or on twisting, flipping known quantities. To me, that's especially scary because I depend on reliable things. We all do. We depend on the structures of government performing as they promise to. We depend on stable family relationships and loving, friendly relationships. Like I said, good horror has a way of turning these near sacred concepts or structures of life into something terrifying. Classic horror movies have something to do with neighbors spying on each other, or people who the protagonist thought were their caregivers, their parents turning out to be horrible, awful people, or the government having far more power over our personal livelihoods than they ought to. There's a lot of those subjects for the classic horror movies. This especially has something to do with personal fears. Now, I confess I'm someone who has a lot of personal fears, and learning about another person's very personal terrors can be a strangely intimate and uncomfortable experience because fear is kind of infectious, and if you pay attention to what makes a person scared, you can actually learn a lot about, you know, everything else about a person if you know what makes them scared. What does this have to do with the horror movies? Well, fear may not be the most powerful emotion that a person can have, but I would argue it's the most basic and probably the most primal, maybe the oldest. And because horror movies try to tap into that primal fear, horror movies will become a gateway towards other genres' concepts and core fundamental principles. Well, how's that work? Well, I just said that if you know what makes a person scares, it's what makes a person scares. If you know what might frighten a person, you can have a pretty good idea of other parts of that person's nature and how uh, they live their lives, at least on a basic level. And because horror, I mean, does that for the entire medium of film, or if it's not a movie, then it does that for just other stories entirely. For example, The Shining is not just about ghosts. The xenomorph is not the only villain in Alien, and fear, as an emotion, though it may try to present itself as a vacuum, only does that because it manifests itself most strongly when we try to look for something outside of fear. The character of Jack Torrance is scary for a variety of reasons, but he's most terrifying because even from the beginning of The Shining, we know that he is a failure as both a father and a husband. He abuses them, he beats them, and then what would you call it? that failure to fulfill his role as a caretaker, as a father and husband, his failure to no, that twisting of the traditional role of a father or fatherly figure is then egged on by the isolation of being at the hotel and, of course, all of the hostile spirits within it. It's funny because they keep calling him the caretaker in the movie, and I think in the book, but they keep calling him that, and he is anything but he acts as anything but a caretaker. And so his failure, not just failure, but his outright destruction of that role contributes to the horror that that character brings, and it challenges us to look at the dependencies that we have, or our dependence rather, on family bonds and the roles we play in our jobs, our roles that we play in society, and whatever resistances we may or may not have towards bad influences. Now, what else have we got? Well, I mentioned Alien, and how do I say this? I can't really say this in a good way, can I? The xenomorph rapes and kills its victims, and the resulting child eats the parents. So first, this violates the preferred intimacy of sex, and it also puts, let's call them parents, in a position that bugs would normally have in their reproductive cycles. Meaning that while a parent would usually, have this vulnerable little creature and they take care of the little kid, instead the kid eats and kills the parents for nourishment and then scurries away and eats everybody else. And all of that information is very clearly and visually depicted. Very unfamiliar, very horrifying. That's why the movie's so great. And then, of course, you have people who are fascinated by this, not just in the academic sense, like maybe arguably I or any other reviewer might be, but in the what can we do with this sense. That's what the whole Wayland-Yutani plotline is about. That's what makes the android character not Bilbo Baggins. I say he's not Bilbo Baggins because it's the same actor. If you don't know that, I'm sorry. But that's what makes that aspect of the plot also equally horrifying. And if you've guessed it by now, I actually don't mind horror at all. Another good horror movie for me would be Hellraiser, not just because of the practical makeup effects and such, but because it deals more with not just horror, but in personal desires and how, we have there are differing ideals and philosophies on how tightly we should rein in our personal desires or how loose we should be with them. And the movie does an interesting take on how far that can go. The second one is okay. It has a purpose. The rest of the Hellraiser movies, not so much. Anyway, you can probably tell from the geeking out that I don't actually hate or mind the horror genre. It's not always fun for me to watch, because I don't even like the illusion of being put into those very horrifying roles or positions, but I can appreciate the artistic value of stories that do put people in those imaginary perspectives, because it can provide a unique insight into human nature the same way that any other piece of good art might, but in a far more intimate and vicariously dangerous manner. It's still not something that I like to watch all the time, especially body horror, but it's still good stuff. It's still good. In conclusion, I think we owe a lot to the horror genre, and as far as getting a vicarious thrill or finding some weird truth about yourself is concerned, horror movies and shows are a much simpler and cleaner way of, getting those than going out and getting into real danger. Like all good entertainment, they provoke those human feelings that help us get through a boring day, and if they're also excellent art, they show truths that we may not think about without prompting, and in that way, horror can actually be quite beautiful. Well, whatever your opinions on all that, thank you so much for listening to this bullet point retrospective rant, and have a good one. Thank you.